was a bright afternoon in the city, the kind of day when rich people showed off their wealth and status. Expensive cars lined up outside the Grand Hotel, their shiny bodies catching the sun like jewels. The air smelled of perfume, leather seats, and pride. Everyone who came there wanted to be noticed, to be seen as powerful and successful. Among the crowd, one woman stood out more than anyone else. She was the CEO of a huge company, a woman known for her wealth, her sharp tongue, and her pride. Wherever she went, people whispered her name. Some admired her for her success, but many feared her because of her arrogance. She wore a suit that probably cost more than an average worker's yearly pay. Diamonds glittered on her wrist and her high heels clicked like a command on the marble floor. She drove herself to the hotel in her luxury sports car, the kind that made people stop and stare. The car was her symbol of power. She believed it proved she was smarter, richer, and above everyone else. As she stepped out of the driver's seat, she flipped her hair with confidence, scanning the crowd as if they were all beneath her. But then something happened that she did not expect. When she tried to start her car again to move it closer to the entrance, the engine sputtered and coughed. She tried again, pressing the button harder this time, but the car refused to start. The loud sound of the failing engine broke the silence, and heads turned. Some people chuckled softly, others smirked. It was rare to see such an expensive car betray its owner, especially in front of so many eyes. The CEO's face tightened with frustration. How could this happen to her of all people? Her pride was hurt, not because the car broke down, but because it broke down in front of witnesses. She looked around quickly, hoping no one saw, but it was too late. A small group had already gathered at a distance, whispering and pointing. Her anger grew. She stepped out again, slammed the door, and waved her hand for someone to call a mechanic. Within minutes, a man walked over carrying a toolbox. His uniform was simple, marked with oil stains from long hours of work. His skin was dark and his hands were rough, showing years of experience fixing engines that rich people never cared to touch themselves. The mechanic walked toward her politely, bowing his head slightly. He said nothing at first, only waiting for instructions. But the CEO didn't greet him with respect. Instead, she looked him up and down as if he were unworthy of standing near her car. Finally, she said loudly so others could hear, "They send me this." Her voice dripped with sarcasm. The people nearby chuckled nervously, some embarrassed by her cruelty, others entertained by it. The mechanic kept his calm expression, but inside he felt the sting of her words. He was used to this kind of treatment, but it never stopped hurting. Still, he did not respond. He only nodded and looked at the car. But the CEO wasn't finished. She placed one hand on her hip and smirked. "Tell me," she said mockingly, "do you even know how to handle a car like this? Or do you only fix broken bicycles on the street?" The crowd laughed harder this time. She enjoyed the sound of their laughter because to her it proved she was above him. She wanted to show everyone that she had the power, not him. The mechanic didn't say a word. He bent down and opened his toolbox, pulling out his instruments. His silence made her even more annoyed. She leaned closer, raising her voice. "Listen carefully," she said. "This car is worth more than your entire life. If you mess it up, you'll never work in this city again." Her words were sharp like knives. They cut deep, but the mechanic kept his head down. He had learned that sometimes silence was stronger than any argument. By now, the crowd had grown larger. People were curious, whispering and waiting to see what would happen. Some pitied the mechanic, others waited to laugh again. The CEO stood tall in front of them, proud and arrogant, as if she were the queen of the street. Then, with a cruel smile, she decided to add one more insult. She tilted her head, looked at the broken engine, and then at the mechanic. In a mocking tone, she said, "You know what? If you fix this engine, I'll marry you." The crowd gasped, then burst into laughter. It wasn't just a joke, it was an insult dressed as humor. She wasn't offering marriage. She was mocking him, comparing his lowly status to her wealth and power. To her, the idea of marrying a mechanic was so ridiculous that it became entertainment. The mechanic froze for a moment. He looked up at her, his eyes calm but filled with quiet fire. He understood what she was doing. She wanted to humiliate him, to make him look small in front of everyone. But instead of responding with anger, he simply closed his toolbox for a second, then opened it again, pulling out the right tool for the job. His silence spoke louder than words. The crowd began to shift uncomfortably. Some laughed less. Some wondered if perhaps he would actually try. The CEO chuckled, turning to the onlookers. "Let's see this little show," she said. "It'll be fun to watch." And just like that, what started as a simple engine failure turned into a stage for pride, arrogance, and the quiet dignity of a man who refused to be broken by cruel words. The mechanic stood in silence, his rough hands resting on the cold edge of the car. Around him, the crowd had already turned this moment into a kind of performance. They whispered, giggled, and exchanged glances as if they were watching a play unfold. But in truth, it wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about pride, respect, and dignity. The CEO crossed her arms and raised her chin, her eyes sharp and filled with arrogance. She wanted control, and humiliating the mechanic in front of so many people gave her that feeling. But it wasn't enough for her just to laugh at him. She wanted to make the moment unforgettable, a story people would carry with them, always remembering her as the one who crushed a poor man's pride. Her lips curved into a cruel smile. She leaned forward slightly and said in a voice that carried over the murmuring crowd, "If you can fix this engine right here, right now, I'll marry you." The words hung in the air like thunder. The crowd froze for a heartbeat, then exploded into laughter. Some people clapped, others shook their heads in disbelief. To them it was a joke, a piece of entertainment served fresh in the middle of the street. Nobody thought she was serious, not even for a second. But for the mechanic, the words were more than a joke. They were a weapon. Her challenge wasn't about marriage at all, it was about shame. She was telling him that his world and her world could never touch. She wanted to show that no matter how skilled he was, he would always be beneath her. The mechanic felt his chest tighten, but he didn't let it show. He had heard insults before. He had been laughed at for his clothes, mocked for his job, dismissed because of his skin. But something in her voice made this insult sharper, heavier. It wasn't just an attack on him. It was an attack on every worker who had ever been looked down on. He lifted his gaze slowly and looked directly into her eyes. For the first time, the crowd noticed the strength in his stare. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry. It was calm, steady, and unshaken. That silence made the laughter around him feel smaller, weaker. The CEO, annoyed by his lack of reaction, tapped her high-heeled shoe against the pavement. "Well," she said mockingly, "don't just stand there. Prove yourself. Or maybe fixing a car like this is too much for someone like you." The crowd chuckled again, but this time not everyone was laughing. A few faces in the audience began to show curiosity. They wondered, what if he really could fix it? What if this wasn't going to end the way she thought? The mechanic finally spoke, his voice low but clear enough for those closest to hear. "Engines don't care about money," he said softly. "They only care about skill." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that quieted some of the laughter. The CEO rolled her eyes, pretending to be unimpressed, but inside, a small seed of irritation began to grow. She hadn't expected him to answer at all. He turned back to his toolbox, kneeling by the car as if the challenge meant nothing to him. His hands moved slowly at first, carefully selecting the right tools. The metallic clinks echoed in the tense air. The crowd leaned closer, their curiosity pulling them in. But the CEO wasn't finished playing her cruel game. "Everyone, watch closely," she announced loudly. "This man thinks he can handle a machine worth more than he'll ever earn in his lifetime. Let's see if he can even make it start." Some laughed again, but the mechanic did not respond. He was already studying the engine, his eyes scanning every part like an artist studying a canvas. To him, this wasn't about the woman or her insult. It was about the machine in front of him, a puzzle waiting to be solved. Minutes passed, and the air grew heavier. The CEO grew restless, tapping her foot harder. She wanted him to fail quickly so she could move on, but he wasn't rushing. His calmness unsettled her. The crowd whispered among themselves. "Do you think he can really fix it?" One asked. "No way. That car is too complicated," another replied. "But look at him," a third voice whispered. "He looks like he knows what he's doing." The mechanic adjusted a part, then tightened another. His brow furrowed in concentration. Sweat slid down the side of his face, but his eyes never lost focus. Every move was deliberate, confident. The CEO laughed again, louder this time, trying to break the silence. "Careful," she sneered. "Don't get your cheap clothes dirty. They don't make suits for men like you." But her voice no longer carried the same power. The crowd wasn't laughing as hard as before. Some were watching with serious faces, waiting, wondering. The balance was shifting, and she could feel it. The mechanic didn't answer. He wiped his hands on a rag, then bent deeper into the engine. The sound of tools clicking filled the air. Each turn of a wrench felt like a step toward something greater than just fixing a car. The CEO crossed her arms tighter. For the first time, she felt something unfamiliar in her chest, a flicker of unease. She had meant to entertain herself by humiliating him, but now the story didn't seem so funny anymore. And so, the challenge she had thrown carelessly became a silent battle of pride and skill. One woman's arrogance against one man's determination. The crowd waited with bated breath, not knowing that they were about to witness something none of them would ever forget. The laughter had faded into uneasy whispers. What started as a joke now carried a strange weight. The crowd that once chuckled at the CEO's cruel words was beginning to sense that something was shifting. The mechanic had not shouted, had not argued, had not begged for respect. Instead, he had chosen silence, a silence filled with determination. Kneeling beside the car, he opened his toolbox wide. Inside were tools worn smooth from years of use. They were not shiny or new, but each carried the memory of countless engines he had fixed. To him, these tools were not just metal. They were extensions of his hands, proof of his skill. He picked up a wrench and leaned into the engine bay. The air smelled of oil, metal, and dust. His brow tightened as he studied the problem. To an outsider, it looked hopeless. Wires twisted, a belt loose, parts too delicate for rough hands. But to him, it was a challenge he had faced 100 times before, just in different forms. The CEO smirked, standing tall like a queen looking down at her subject. "You're wasting your time," she said, her voice sharp. "That engine is too advanced for someone like you." Her words were meant to sting, but the mechanic did not flinch. His silence was his shield. One by one, he tested different parts. His fingers were steady, his eyes unblinking. He worked as if the insults did not exist, as if the only thing in the world that mattered was the heartbeat of the machine before him. The crowd leaned in closer, whispering. They expected him to fail, yet something about his calm movements made them hesitate. Minutes dragged on. Sweat gathered on his forehead, dripping onto his shirt. His breathing grew heavier, but his focus never broke. Every twist of a bolt, every adjustment of a screw was made with care. He was not rushing to impress anyone. He was working the way he always did, with patience, precision, and respect for the machine. A boy in the crowd tugged at his father's sleeve and whispered, "Papa, he looks like he knows everything about cars." The father, once laughing, now watched in silence. Slowly, the mood in the group began to shift. What was once entertainment was turning into admiration. The CEO noticed this too. Her smile weakened. She spoke louder, trying to pull the attention back to herself. "Don't be fooled," she said. "He's pretending. This car will never start again." Her voice echoed, but it sounded less confident than before. The mechanic ignored her completely. In his mind, her voice was nothing more than distant noise. He thought of his years of struggle, long days working under the sun, long nights fixing engines to earn just enough to survive. He thought of every person who had looked at him as though he were less. This moment was not about her challenge anymore. It was about proving something deeper, that skill and dignity mattered more than wealth and arrogance. He reached for another tool, adjusting the smallest of wires with steady hands. He tightened the belt, then checked the fuel line. His movements were slow but sure, like a man solving a puzzle only he understood. The crowd held its breath, waiting. The CEO tapped her heel impatiently, her voice sharp. "Hurry up! Or are you stalling because you know you can't do it?" she mocked. But even she could see something was wrong. Her words no longer carried the same laughter from the people around her. Many eyes had turned from her to the mechanic, and for the first time she wasn't the center of attention. The mechanic wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. His eyes narrowed as he leaned deeper into the engine. It was almost as if he was listening to the car, feeling its heartbeat through the vibrations under his fingers. Slowly, he began to see the problem clearly, a hidden fault that most mechanics would have missed at first glance. The whispers in the crowd grew stronger. Some began to root for him quietly. "Maybe he can do it," someone said. "He looks serious," another added. But the mechanic heard none of it. His world was now just him and the machine. His silence was not weakness, it was power. It was the language of focus, of a man who had nothing to prove with words. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the tension grew. He tightened the last bolt and stepped back for a moment, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. He wasn't finished yet, but the hardest part was over. He had seen the path forward. The CEO crossed her arms, but her face betrayed a flicker of doubt. She told herself it was impossible, yet her eyes couldn't ignore the confidence in his hands. The mechanic reached into his toolbox one last time, his grip steady. His silence spoke to everyone watching. He wasn't doing this for a bet or for her mockery. He was doing this because it was his craft, his pride, his way of answering insults without ever raising his voice. And with every silent move he made, the crowd realized something the CEO refused to admit. This was no ordinary man. This was someone whose dignity could not be broken, no matter how loudly the world tried to laugh at him. The stage was set. The engine was ready. And soon, the sound that would follow would silence every cruel word ever spoken against him. The air around the car felt heavier now. The crowd, once buzzing with laughter, had fallen into a strange silence broken only by whispers and the metallic clink of the mechanic's tools. Every eye was on him. Every breath seemed to wait for what he would do next. The mechanic's hands moved with focus, but inside, he knew the truth. This engine wasn't an easy fix. It wasn't just a loose screw or a drained battery. Something deeper was wrong, something hidden. He could feel it in the way the parts resisted, in the way the wires seemed misaligned, in the way the machine itself almost groaned under his touch. He frowned, leaning closer, sweat dripping into his eyes. The sun pressed down on his back, the air thick with heat and tension. His shirt clung to his skin, soaked from both effort and nerves. Still, his eyes remained sharp, scanning, searching for the fault. Behind him, the CEO stood tall, arms crossed, her diamond bracelet flashing in the light as if mocking him with every movement. She had grown restless again, her smirk returning as she watched him struggle. "Is this it?" she asked loudly, her voice slicing through the silence. "All this talk of skill, and yet you can't even make my car breathe again. Maybe I should have asked someone else, someone who actually knows what they're doing." Her words stung, but the mechanic didn't raise his head. He tightened a bolt with force, then checked the engine belts again. He could feel the pressure, her voice, the watching eyes, the weight of her cruel promise. For a second, doubt tried to creep in. What if he failed here in front of everyone? What if all he did was prove her right? But then he took a deep breath and steadied himself. He had faced harder struggles than this broken engine. Nights of hunger, days of endless labor, years of disrespect. Those struggles had not broken him, and neither would this. Still, the car refused to respond. He adjusted one wire, then another, but the engine stayed cold. He clenched his jaw. This was no ordinary fault. It was a test of patience, of endurance. His arms ached, his back burned, but his resolve only grew stronger. The crowd leaned in closer now, their whispers louder. Some shook their heads. "He's not going to do it," one muttered. "It's impossible." Another chuckled nervously. She was right, he's just wasting time. But a few voices were different. "No," someone whispered. "Look at him. He's not giving up." The mechanic pressed his ear closer to the engine, listening carefully. To him, every machine had a sound, a heartbeat. This one's heartbeat was faint, struggling, but it was still there. He only had to find the right place to heal it. Minutes passed, each one stretching like an eternity. His hands grew dirtier, his body heavier, yet his eyes never lost their fire. He pulled out a small flashlight, shining it deep inside the machine. There, hidden behind wires, he spotted it. A worn connection, barely visible. It was the kind of flaw most would overlook. His lips pressed into a thin line. That was it. That was the root of the problem. But reaching it wouldn't be easy. It was buried deep, difficult to access. He would have to dismantle more parts, risk damaging something else. His muscles trembled at the thought, but his determination pushed him forward. He dug in again, loosening pieces carefully, sweat running down his neck. Each movement felt like a battle. His fingers cramped, his arms burned, but he refused to stop. His silence was no longer just determination. It was defiance. The CEO rolled her eyes, pretending to be bored, but she couldn't hide the way her gaze lingered on his hands. She had wanted to see him fail quickly, yet here he was, still fighting, still refusing to surrender to her laughter. A small knot of irritation twisted in her chest. "Pathetic," she sneered, though her voice lacked its earlier sharpness. "Even if you fix it, you're still nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing." The words hit the air, heavy and cruel. For a brief moment, the mechanic paused, his hand hovering over the engine. The crowd looked at him, waiting to see if the insult had broken him at last. But then, slowly, he smiled. Not at her, not at them, but to himself, because he knew. He knew that every twist of his wrench, every turn of his tool, was building toward something she could not take away from him. Victory born from resilience. He leaned deeper, reaching the hidden flaw, his hands steady even as exhaustion weighed on him. The tension in the air grew unbearable. The crowd hardly breathed, waiting. The CEO tapped her foot impatiently, but her smirk had faded again, and then with one final push he connected the part. The sound of the tool snapping into place echoed like thunder. He exhaled deeply, his body trembling from the effort. The hardest struggle was done, but would it work? That was the question everyone held in their throats like a trapped breath. The mechanic wiped his hands on his rag, his chest rising and falling heavily. He stood there for a moment silent, staring at the car as though it were a living thing. The struggle had taken nearly everything from him, but not his spirit. Now only one moment stood between him and the truth of her challenge. The street had gone silent. The only sounds were the mechanic's steady breathing and the faint clink of tools against steel. People who once laughed were now leaning in, eyes wide, hearts beating faster. Everyone sensed it, the moment was close. Something was about to happen. The mechanic's shirt was damp with sweat, his hands streaked with oil and dust, but his eyes were calm, sharp, and alive with focus. He had spent his energy, fought against exhaustion, pushed through every obstacle, and now he stood at the edge of a decision. The hidden fault had been fixed, the parts reconnected, but the engine had not yet spoken. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and stepped back, staring at the machine like a soldier staring at an enemy he had finally conquered. For him, the car was not just metal and bolts anymore. It was a test of dignity, a trial given to him by fate. The CEO tilted her head, arms still crossed, but her confidence was cracked. She was no longer laughing. Her diamond bracelet didn't glitter as brightly in the fading sun. Her lips were tight, her eyes restless. She wanted to believe he had failed, but her heart whispered a fear she would never admit. What if he actually did it? The mechanic placed his hand on the car door and slid into the driver's seat. The crowd leaned forward as one, holding their breath. He pressed the ignition button. For a second, nothing happened. The silence stretched painfully long. The CEO let out a short, cruel laugh, eager to reclaim her power. "See, I told you," she said sharply, her voice echoing. "It was hopeless. You wasted your time." But then, a low rumble stirred beneath the hood. The crowd froze. The mechanic leaned forward, turning a small adjustment he had made earlier, and then suddenly the roar came. The engine sprang to life with a growl so loud, so powerful that it echoed off the walls of the hotel. The car, silent for so long, now roared like a beast set free. The noise rolled through the street like thunder, drowning out every laugh, every whisper, every cruel word. The crowd erupted. Gasps, cheers, and claps filled the air. People shouted in disbelief, some even jumping in excitement. "He did it!" Someone cried. "Impossible!" Another exclaimed. Faces that once sneered at him now glowed with admiration. They had all witnessed the impossible. The CEO's face drained of color. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Her eyes darted from the car to the mechanic as if reality itself had betrayed her. Just moments ago, she was certain of his failure. Now the very machine she had trusted to embarrass him had become his greatest triumph. The mechanic stepped out of the car slowly, wiping his hands on his rag. His face was calm, but his eyes carried a quiet fire. He didn't smile, he didn't boast. He simply stood tall, his silence louder than any victory speech. The crowd surged closer, clapping him on the back, praising his skill. "Unbelievable," one man shouted. "I've never seen anything like it," said another. Even those who laughed the loudest earlier now looked at him with respect, their eyes full of awe. The CEO tried to recover her composure. She forced a laugh, but it came out weak, trembling. Well, that was lucky," she muttered, her voice breaking. But the crowd didn't listen to her anymore. Their eyes weren't on her. They were on the man she had mocked. The mechanic, still silent, folded his rag and placed it back in his toolbox. His movements were steady, deliberate, almost ceremonial. He didn't even look at her. His actions said it all. He had nothing to prove anymore. But the people around them hadn't forgotten her words. "You said you'd marry him if he fixed it," one voice shouted. Others joined in, laughing, mocking her now. "A promise is a promise," another teased. The laughter turned against her, echoing around like the cruel mirror of her own arrogance. Her face flushed red, her pride pierced. She waved her hands dismissively, trying to laugh it off. "It was just a joke," she snapped. "You all know I didn't mean it." But no one cared about her excuses. The truth was clear to everyone. She had underestimated him, ridiculed him, and now stood humiliated before all. The mechanic finally turned his eyes to her. For the first time since the challenge began, he looked at her fully. His gaze wasn't angry, it wasn't mocking, it was steady, calm, and dignified. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need her approval. His victory was already complete. The CEO shivered under that gaze. She had everything, wealth, power, status, but in that moment, she realized she lacked the one thing he carried with ease: respect, earned through skill and humility. The engine purred behind them, smooth and steady, a living reminder of his triumph. It was more than just a car running. It was proof that determination, dignity, and skill could silence arrogance louder than any words ever could, and so, the breakthrough moment wasn't just about a machine coming back to life. It was about a man rising above humiliation, turning a cruel insult into a victory that the world around them would never forget. The roar of the engine still echoed in the air, like a lion announcing its power to the jungle. People covered their ears for a moment, then dropped their hands in disbelief. The sound wasn't just noise, it was proof. Proof that the mechanic had done the impossible. The crowd, which only minutes earlier had laughed at him, now exploded into cheers. They clapped, shouted, and whistled. Strangers who had mocked his stained clothes and calloused hands now leaned forward with admiration. Some even rushed closer, eager to see the man who had humbled arrogance with nothing but skill and patience. One man, shaking his head in amazement, muttered, "I've seen mechanics work before, but never like that. He made it look like magic." Another added, "Magic? No, that's years of hard work. That's a man who knows his craft better than anyone here." The mechanic didn't lift his head to bask in the glory. He simply wiped his hands again, calm and quiet, as if this victory were just another day's work. But to everyone else, it was more than a fix, it was a lesson. The CEO stood frozen, her arms still crossed, but her chest rising and falling in short, sharp breaths. Her diamond bracelet no longer sparkled with pride. It only reminded the crowd of her arrogance, of the words she had thrown so carelessly. And those words came back to her like arrows. "You said you'd marry him if he fixed it." A voice shouted from the crowd. Laughter erupted, this time not at the mechanic but at her. "Yes," another joined in, grinning. "We all heard you. If you fix this engine, I'll marry you." The CEO's face burned red. She waved her hand dismissively, trying to force control. "It was a joke," she snapped, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean it literally." But the crowd didn't let her escape. They laughed louder, mocking her just as she had mocked him. The echo of her own arrogance now returned like a cruel mirror, and she hated every second of it. "Funny, isn't it?" a woman in the back called out. "When he was struggling, it was hilarious to you. Now you're the one who looks foolish." The CEO clenched her jaw, her perfect image cracking. She wanted to scream at them, to remind them who she was. The powerful woman, the leader, the untouchable. But none of that mattered anymore. In that moment, all her wealth, all her status, all her diamonds couldn't silence the truth in front of her. She had been wrong. The mechanic finally turned his gaze toward the crowd. He didn't raise his arms or shout. He didn't bow or thank them. He simply looked at them, calm and steady. His silence spoke louder than their cheers. "I did not need your approval before, and I do not need it now." This quiet strength only made the crowd respect him more. A man with nothing but his toolbox had turned humiliation into victory, and he did it without losing his dignity. To them, he wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was proof that respect comes not from wealth, but from character. Children pointed at him with wide eyes, whispering to their parents. "Papa, he's a hero," one child said softly, and the father who once laughed nodded quietly. "Yes, he is." The CEO, meanwhile, tried to recover. She forced a smile that fooled no one. "Fine," she said in a shaky voice. "You fixed it, congratulations, but don't expect anything else." "I wasn't serious," but her words only made the crowd laugh harder. "Not serious," someone called. "You were serious enough when you mocked him. Now it's your turn to taste your own medicine." Her pride shattered further. She could feel the shift. This was no longer her stage. She had lost the spotlight, and the man she tried to humiliate now stood taller than her, even in silence. The mechanic bent down, closed his toolbox with a click, and stood straight. The noise of the crowd swirled around him, cheers, laughter, praise, but he remained steady, grounded. He did not need to rub his victory in her face. His victory was already written in the engine's roar, in the respect shining in the eyes of those who once mocked him. The CEO looked at him desperately, as if searching for a way to claw back her pride. But when his calm eyes met hers, she felt something she had not felt in years. Shame. Pure, burning shame. She turned her face away, but it was too late. The world had seen, and more painfully he had seen. The man she believed was beneath her had shown her the truth. Arrogance collapses the moment it is faced with quiet strength. The crowd clapped louder, calling his name though they did not know it. To them, he wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was a man who had silenced wealth with skill, who had answered cruelty with patience. And in their eyes, he was worth more than all the diamonds she wore. The CEO's fingers tightened around her bracelet, her pride crumbling piece by piece. She had tried to make him small. Instead, she had made him great. And as the engine purred steadily behind them, the truth was undeniable. The world would forget her arrogance, but they would never forget the man who fixed the impossible and walked away with dignity unbroken. The engine purred steadily, its low hum filling the air like a reminder that the impossible had just been done. The mechanic stood silently beside it, toolbox in hand, while the crowd still buzzed with excitement. But the cheers were no longer directed at the car. They were for him, the man she had ridiculed. The CEO stood stiff, her arms crossed tightly, her smile gone. Every laugh in the crowd now felt like a dagger in her chest. She wanted to leave, to vanish into her expensive car and drive away, but she couldn't. Not with so many eyes locked on her, not with her own words echoing back at her like a curse. "You said you'd marry him," someone shouted again, and the crowd broke into fresh laughter. This time the laughter wasn't at the mechanic, it was at her. The powerful woman, the untouchable CEO, now looked like the fool, her stomach twisted. She had thrown those words carelessly, thinking they would humiliate him. To her, it had been nothing more than a cruel joke, a performance to remind everyone of their places. But now the stage had turned against her, and she could feel the walls closing in. Her mind raced. What should I do? She thought. If she admitted defeat, she would lose her image. If she tried to escape, the crowd would call her a coward. And if she kept mocking him, she risked being laughed at even louder. She forced a shaky laugh, raising her hand as though to wave away the noise. "Come on, people," she said, her voice trembling under the weight of their stares. "It was just a joke. Do you really think I'd marry someone like him?" But her words only made it worse. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a sharp silence. Her attempt to insult him again only deepened her shame. For the first time, she realized the people weren't on her side anymore. A man from the crowd spoke firmly, his voice carrying authority. "You should be ashamed," he said. "You mocked him and he proved you wrong. Instead of respect, you're still throwing insults." Others nodded, murmuring their agreement. Her heart pounded. Never before had she felt so cornered. She was used to being praised, feared, envied. Now, for the first time, she was being judged. And the weight of that judgment was crushing. The mechanic remained silent, his eyes calm as he watched her. That silence terrified her more than any words could. If he had shouted, if he had mocked her back, she could have fought back. But he gave her nothing, no weakness to grab onto, no anger to twist against him. Only quiet dignity, standing taller than her pride. She looked at him, desperate to find something, anything that would save her from the trap of her own arrogance. Her mind screamed, "He's beneath you. He'll always be beneath you." But her heart whispered another truth. He stood where you thought he would fall, and you fell where you thought you stood tall. The crowd pressed closer, waiting. Some shouted again, laughing at her broken promise. "A deal is a deal. Keep your word. Don't run away now." Her hands trembled. She wanted to scream at them to remind them who she was, but she couldn't find her voice. Because deep inside, she knew. It wasn't about the promise anymore. It was about the respect she had lost. For years, she had believed respect came from wealth, from power, from commanding fear. But in one afternoon, a man with oil-stained hands had earned more respect with silence than she ever had with diamonds. That truth burned her from the inside. Her eyes darted to the car, the engine still running smoothly as if mocking her pride. It wasn't supposed to end this way. She had wanted to prove her superiority. Instead, she had become the lesson. And so she faced her dilemma. Should she double down on her arrogance, pretend the moment didn't matter, and walk away? Or should she admit in front of everyone that she was wrong, that the man she mocked had beaten her? Her pride and her fear fought like fire and ice inside her. Pride screamed, "Never bow to him." But fear whispered, "If you keep mocking, you'll lose everything you've built." The mechanic's eyes met hers again, calm and steady. That gaze pierced her like glass. He wasn't asking for anything. Not revenge, not marriage, not even acknowledgement. His silence said only one thing: "You know the truth." And so do they. Her throat tightened. For the first time in years, she felt small. Smaller than she had ever allowed herself to be. The crowd's laughter and whispers swirled around her. And she knew no matter what she did, this day would follow her forever. Her heart raced. Her palms grew damp and the weight of her own words crushed her chest. She, the woman who thought she was untouchable, now stood trapped in the cage she had built with her own arrogance. And in that moment, she realized the bitter truth. Her greatest enemy had never been him. It had always been her pride. The air was heavy with expectation. The crowd leaned in, their voices rising and falling in waves of laughter, shouts, and whispers. The CEO stood stiff, her pride in pieces, while the man she mocked stood calm and silent, his toolbox closed, his work complete. The car purred smoothly behind them, its steady hum reminding everyone of the promise, of the insult, of the humiliation turned upside down. The people pressed closer, pointing and shouting, "You said you'd marry him. A deal's a deal. Don't back out now." The CEO's face was pale. She tried to keep her chin high, but the weight of their stares pressed down on her shoulders like iron. Every second of silence dragged her deeper into shame. She felt trapped, desperate, and powerless in a way she had never known before. The mechanic looked at her, his eyes calm but unshakable. For a long moment, the world seemed to freeze, her trembling pride against his quiet strength. The crowd held its breath, waiting for his response. And then, slowly, he spoke. His voice was steady, deep, and filled with quiet power. "I don't need your promise," he said. "Respect is worth more than marriage spoken in mockery." The words fell into the crowd like thunder. For a heartbeat, there was silence. So complete it felt as though even the car stopped listening. Then, all at once, gasps rippled through the people. Some clapped, some shouted in admiration, and many simply stared at him in awe. Because in that moment, he had turned everything upside down again. The woman who thought herself powerful had been stripped of her pride, and the man she had tried to belittle walked away not just victorious but untouchable. The CEO's lips parted, but no sound came. For the first time in her life, she had nothing to say. Her weapons, her words, her money, her arrogance meant nothing here. He had defeated her without raising his voice, without demanding revenge. His dignity had been sharper than her cruelty. He bent down, lifted his toolbox, and turned toward the crowd. People moved aside, clearing a path for him. Some clapped him on the back as he passed. Others bowed their heads slightly, as if in respect. Children pointed at him with wide eyes, whispering to their parents, "That's the man who beat her." And yet he never boasted. He never smiled in triumph. He walked with quiet steps, as though this was not a victory, but simply another day's work. Behind him, the CEO's knees felt weak. She wanted to scream at him, to call him back, to throw one last insult, but she couldn't. His words echoed in her ears, drowning out her pride. Respect is worth more than marriage spoken in mockery. She realized with a shiver that he had given her something she did not deserve, a chance to leave with her dignity if she chose to take it. He could have humiliated her further, forced her to bow, trapped her in her own promise. But he hadn't. He had chosen to walk away. That choice cut deeper than any revenge, because it showed her the truth. He had power, but not the kind she understood. Not money, not status, but the kind of power that comes from self-respect, from discipline, from never letting the world decide your worth. The crowd watched him disappear down the street, the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. Their whispers followed him, voices filled with respect. He's a true man. He didn't just fix her car, he fixed her pride. I'll never forget this. The CEO stood alone now, surrounded by people, but lonelier than ever. For the first time she felt small, not because of him, but because of herself. The shame burned inside her chest, but along with it something else grew, a faint, painful realization. She had spent her life chasing wealth, control, and power, believing that respect could be bought with diamonds or demanded with fear. But this man had shown her, in silence and sweat, that respect was something earned. And she, with all her riches, had none. Her eyes drifted to the car, the same car she once used as a symbol of superiority. Now it felt like a cage, a reminder of her arrogance. She touched the door handle, but her hand trembled. She could drive away, leave the scene, pretend it never happened. But she knew, no matter where she went, this day would follow her, because everyone there would carry the story. The story of the CEO who mocked a mechanic, and the mechanic who humbled her not with words but with skill, dignity, and silence. And she would carry it too. As the crowd slowly dispersed, still buzzing with the memory, the CEO finally sat in the driver's seat. The engine hummed beneath her hands, smooth and steady, fixed by the very man she ridiculed. She gripped the wheel tightly, staring ahead, her reflection in the glass looking back at her like a stranger. For the first time in her life, she wished she could be someone else, someone with the kind of strength he carried without ever asking for it. And in that moment, she understood. Wealth could buy anything, but not respect. Diamonds could shine, but they could never glow with the light of dignity. And the man she had mocked had walked away richer than she could ever be.